thank you, Professor Majumder, for joining us, for talking about Naksha. And I encountered the word Naksha in Hutoom Pecha'r Naksha first, but I don't know how this kind of genre and this word came into literature. So could you tell us what is Naksha and what is its history?
So first of all, thank you for having me. What you've asked, Shubhendu, it's a really interesting question, and I'm afraid that I don't have a full answer, right, or at least as much as I would like. So Naksha is something, as you mentioned, one encounters in with response to Hutoom Pecha'r Naksha. So there are, I can tell you what I think in terms of what a Naksha is, right? That it's a vernacular prose genre, right, in Bangla or Bengali literature, right? And as far as actual texts go, there are surprisingly few examples of literature that we can straight out describe as Naksha. One of which is Kaliprasanna Sinha's Hutoom Pecha'r Naksha, right, published in the 1860s. And it's been translated into English as The Wondrous Owl. And the other one that I personally like a great deal is the Marxist sociologist Binoy Ghosh's Naksha from the mid-20th century. So almost a century later, published again in the 1960s, Kaalpechar Naksha, the inauspicious owl, which sadly remains untranslated. And there are a few other examples that one can think of here and there. The term itself in Bangla simply means a design, right? The real importance of the Naksha, I think, is not in the scarcity of texts, which are few and far between, but rather in the fact that it represents to me a particular kind of, literary narrative that articulates a kind of realist critique. So Nakshas typically cover various aspects of life. It portrays in detail various sections of society, the high and the low. But in particular, it is deeply invested in sort of exposing the pretensions and the hypocrisies of the elite in particular, right? So it's realist in that sense. The other notable use, of course, is its deployment of a very specific register of the vernacular, right, which is colloquial, vulgar, popular, and very far from standardized sort of language. So all of these things, I think, make Naksha significant in its own right as a mode, right, rather than as a genre. And so in that way, the impact of the genre actually transcends the few texts that we've just mentioned. It can be traced to other novels in subsequent periods, and I would say to earlier moments as well, prior to the 19th century. And because the 19th century is such a sort of important dividing line for the standardization of genres and so on and so forth, it's interesting that the Naksha can sort of transcend those divisions as well. So in some ways we can kind of trace it not only to prose but also to forms of poetry and drama, right? Because really those distinctions only come into play post the 19th century, right? And so the Naksha can be traced to other genres and modes of writing as well.
So this is really interesting how you say that it can be sort of traced in other genres like poetry or drama. So could you maybe provide some examples as to what kind of tropes or what is recognizable about the Naksha which we can find in later literature?
So one of those, is, as I just mentioned, the particular, use of register, right? That this is language, probably in its most free-flowing, demotic and popular sort of form. And so as a result, right, it necessarily, and the other thing I should mention in this regard, of course, is the specificity of the narrator figure as well, right? That it is usually somebody, the owls in both cases, right? This nocturnal creature, but generally somebody who is an all-seeing sort of narrator, right? And somebody who has easy access to all quarters of society and is frequently, sort of commenting on things that are largely sort of beyond the pale of established norms of politeness and decorum and so on. The other sort of aspect that is interesting, and we see this in both Kaliprasanna and in Binoy Ghosh subsequently, right? That it is constantly talking about not only the high and the low, the elite and the popular, but also the distinction between the country and the city, to use Raymond Williams's term, because the popular classes, right, who inhabit sort of the lower depths of the city, are not quite urbanized. And so therefore, many of their manners, many of their sort of attachments, their modes of thinking, and so on, hark back to the city, right? And so the difference between the country and the city sort of play a major role in Naksha narratives. Now, in terms of its impact on later writing, right? So one of the things, obviously, is in terms of Bengali literary history, the Naksha is often taken to be a precursor, to the more recognizable novel. Although, like in many cases, the novel also predates the Naksha. But in the 20th century, one could say, and these are just examples that I'm citing, a fuller discussion probably would take much longer. Nabarun Bhattacharya's Fataru novels, for example, or even, Anglophone novels like Arvind Adiga's The White Tiger.
Mhm.
Right? One could argue deploy the mode of the Naksha, right? Which is why I said that it's more of a mode than a genre by itself. And as far as the earlier tropes are concerned, like one could also find such examples of realist critique and popular registers, in vernacular Bangla literature as well.
Great, thank you. I really like this amalgamation of the realist critique and the popular register that you talk about, because I want to know more about the, as you say, the Naksha narrator is kind of an all-seeing eye. And two of the most prominent Naksha narratives both have owls, Hutoom Pecha'r Naksha and Binoy Ghosh's Kaalpechar. So, is there anything specific to the owl that connects with the Naksha? And both of them talk about the streets, but they are talking about, for instance, Hutoom is talking more about the babus and the immersion of the Durga and Durga Puja and so on, as opposed to that Binoy Ghosh is often talking about rickshaws and more kind of street level views, is more into the crowd, so to speak. And it's, of course, Calcutta, which is a bigger city because it's mid 20th century. So how do impersonations play a role in Naksha narratives of the narrator?
That's an interesting question, right? And I think one can answer the two ways. One is, of course, through reference to historical and social sort of factors, right? Which is obviously, the more commonsensical one. So let's start with that one first, right? So the question of, the narrator figure, or the what you mentioned as impersonation. Right? So part of, I think, the point of the Naksha is that the narrator kind of makes its appearance, right, during moments of great social upheaval. And this is true both for the 1860s, as well as the 1950s and 1960s, right? Within the subcontinent, we've had epochal sort of events, right? So the Sepoy uprising in the 19th century, the passing of power from the East India Company to the crown, and in the latter case, in Binoy Ghosh's case, independence and partition and things like that. Right? So there is this sense of epochal change, right? And the Naksha, particularly the narrator figure of the Naksha, tries to articulate that sort of moment and that sense of crisis and sense of doom, right? And so I think the figure of the owl, in that strictly social and historical sense, right, would refer to an outsider or a marginal, and as well as a non-human sort of figure. And so somebody who has a particular kind of perch, right, or vantage through which to try and articulate, the kind of changes that we get to witness in the Naksha. And I think the point you made about sort of the difference in altitude between Hutoom's owl and Binoy Ghosh's owl, one is, the former being slightly more elevated, and the one at ground level is also interesting, right? And it refers to the kind of for lack of a better term, the social positions of the writers themselves, right? So Kaliprasanna, as we know, was very much part of the urban literati coming into being in the 19th century. So this was only one of his major works. The other, of course, is his translation of the Mahabharata from Sanskrit to Bengali, right? So he represents a particular kind of modern day liberal, 19th century sort of an intellectual. And he often, unlike his own position, his narrator often takes on, deeply conservative sort of positions. And then articulates, so many of the critiques of the new elite are articulated from a very paradoxical standpoint of the social conservative. Binoy Ghosh's case, when we come to it, nearly a century later, is obviously different, right? He's a trained academic, he's a Marxist, he would go on to write, very important sociological and historical sort of works on the 19th century, and so on. And so in some ways, his position vis-a-vis the literati is a much more critical one, as a Marxist, as somebody who believes in a particular kind of politics. And so I think part of what he tries to do in his text, and which kind of marks it out as similar to but also different from Hutoom, is that he tries to find the proletariat, the traditional Marxist proletariat in the popular classes in the city, and ultimately, this is what I write in one of my essays, ultimately fails to find them, right? And instead he encounters a mass of people who cannot be traditionally reduced to the category of the proletariat. And in fact, they are much more heterogeneous and much more complex, to identify. And so I call it, the lumpen classes, but that's a separate sort of thing, again, taking from Marxist theories of the proletariat vis-a-vis the lumpen. So these are certain, I think, social and historical points that we can talk about in terms of framing the narrator figure. When we come to literary history, I think the question of impersonation, the question of narrativization and characterization and so on and so forth, it takes on a different sort of valence, right? And part of, I think, that the reason for the appearance of the owl, not that it has any physical or even philosophical significance, right? We see the owl in John poetry, for example, in the mid-20th modernist era. But more than that, I think it has to do with the structure of fables, right? And so I mentioned narrative traditions which are pre-colonial. I think it has to do with the structure of fables and the use of birds, for example, which we see in Vaishnav Sahitya. We see this in some of the earlier tales, right? And much of which was circulating over much larger spaces geographically than simply either Bengal or even the subcontinent. Right? To give you one example, we know of the Brihot Kotha, right? The Kotha, Sagar, written in Sanskrit, right, but which was circulating in Persian and Arabic throughout the Indian Ocean world, right, in the pre-colonial era. We also know of the Picaresque, right, the figure of the Picaro in Iberian, particularly Spanish literature, and we know of the Maqamat, the Arabic tradition of short story writing, which is very closely connected to the Picaro, right? And so both the Picaresque and the Maqamat, right, which we get the Bangla word Mokam, right, from same sources. So if they refer to episodic sort of narratives, short narratives involving usually a trickster figure or a rogue figure, somebody, again, who's marginal to the mainstream, right, as articulating various sort of cases of deception and dishonesty and so on and so forth. So in terms of, where the narrator comes from, right, if we look at it from a literary historical perspective, I think there's a lot to be said about the circulation of, various forms of narrative. Right? And in particular, I say this because in many ways, it's very easy to think of the Naksha as a vernacular form that is responding to the English novel and so on. But I personally think that it's much more complex than that. It's not simply English and Bangla, right? But it's a much more multifaceted and multilingual sort of negotiation between the cosmopolitan languages, right? All the European languages, but also Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic, right? And the vernacular that is Bangla at this point. And so there's this constant sort of borrowing and going back and forth between literary tropes and narrative sort of tropes between and across these various genres that we need to take account of in order to sort of fully understand the kind of narrativization that is taking place at this point.
But you would say that there is a difference in terms of the class that the owl narrator belongs to, and something like the narrator in a picaresque novel or a Maqamat. Did you say that the owl narrator is not a lumpen, for example? Like, what is the difference between the outcasts of society as such and the owl narrator?
Yes. So you're right. The owl figure is not a lumpen, right? But the narrator's position is that of an omniscient narrator, right? Somebody who knows everything and somebody who sees everything. And so in that way, the narrator himself, right, or itself, does not occupy a particular social position. Right? And so in that way, it's actually closer, to the novel, to the European realist novel, in the sense that it is trying to portray the many social classes that exist, either in harmony or in conflict, right? But in some kind of relationality with one another, right? At any given point in society. So that is why I said at the very beginning, that it's useful to think of the Naksha as a genre or a mode that is constantly negotiating between the elite and the popular, sections of society, right? And the kind of, juxtapositions and back and forth that is going on between those two sections. Now, of course, we have subaltern studies telling us otherwise, right? That the domain of the subaltern ran at a parallel to that of the elite, and they never intersect, and so on and so forth. But I think that in the case of literary history at all, that is a little more complicated, and we actually see far more interactions than you would otherwise suppose.
I would like you to tell us a little bit more about the multiple genres and languages that the Naksha is negotiating. You already mentioned Maqamat, the realist novel, Picaresque. There is also the Persian Naqsha. And I'm forgetting the exact title, but there was this Persian novel which also has the owl in its title, that was published in early 20th century. And it was published in Bombay. I'm forgetting the name of the author. But in general, what I would like to know a little bit more is how this kind of multifacetedness in terms of the genre that we see in Naksha exemplify the larger heterogeneity of the Indian novel. Because we know that novel is this European form that comes, especially the realist novel, that comes to India, and then it takes multiple specific modes in the vernacular languages. But how these earlier pre-colonial narrative modes, they survive within the diegetic structure of the Indian novel. And then there are also these multiple nodes of influence and inspiration that is happening throughout the period of the development of the Indian novel. So could you tell us a little bit more about that issue?
Yeah. I think, in many ways, that is the sort of, the crux of the matter, right? And it's a very complex thing to, try and talk about, right, in a short span of time. But let me try and sort of say a few things in brief, right? So one of the problems, right, with this idea of, the European novel coming to India and sort of becoming Indian and so on, is that it assumes that everything happens at once, right? And so the colonial moment marks this, great break where, all that is solid previously melts into the air and so on. But in some ways, I think that is not really true. And so we mentioned previously, right, the existence of other, or let me backtrack a little bit by saying this, that when we think of literary history, right, I think the concept that is most useful to understanding this question is that non-synchronicity. And I think in the case of the novel, that is exactly what is happening, right? That we don't, it is not true that, the European novel sort of displaces, right, all prior narrative modes, right? But they sort of coexist, and they do so for extended amounts of time, right? Lasting nearly a century, right? Before like the more standardized novel gets its form, right? So throughout the 19th century, possibly, even later, we see constant back and forth going on between these traditions. That's point number one. non-synchronicity. The second is, again, going back to something I said earlier, I think the importance of the English tradition in particular is overemphasized. Right? As we know, so the first Europeans in that part of the world, in Eastern India, were actually the Portuguese. Yeah. And so many of the foundational sort of events of vernacular Bangla took place, including, say, for example, the writing of the first grammar took place much before the advent of the English and under the aegis of the Portuguese. And so, as we already know, that early modern Iberia, Spain and Portugal, was also a heavily multilingual space. It also involved Arabic as well as Persian influences. And so from the 16th century onwards, I would say that particularly in the Bay of Bengal area, when the Portuguese and the Dutch start making their presence felt, that these were also forms that kind of traveled. And then there are things that are already existing within Bengal and within South Asia at that point that kind of merge together. And so we begin to appreciate, the question of multilingualism and multiliterary traditions, right? Once we keep this particular historical sort of trajectory in mind, that the British colonization of India, although very important, obviously for historical reasons, in terms of literary influence, I think was a little more complex than we usually make it out to be, right? And as far as the Persian influence goes, again, this is very sort of this can be answered at multiple levels, right? So even in the 1820s and 1830s, shortly before Persian was to be replaced as the official language by English in 1835, but even slightly before that, we have evidence of multiple Persian magazines being published in Calcutta, right? Some of them were also multilingual. And in fact, like, Shrapan Chakraborty, who taught me, and I think taught both of you as well, has written on this, on the presence of multilingual magazines being published from Calcutta that were in Persian, English, but also Hindi and Bangla. So four or five languages in the same page. So that sort of multilingualism was very much a part of the literary moment in the mid 19th century. Multiple intellectuals wrote or knew these languages, right? Something that we've lost sight of. And there is also this this larger question that if we extend the conversation a little further in time, that the zone of the Persianate, right, was in fact very much alive and kicking till the early decades of the 20th century, not only in South Asia, right, but also in Central Asia and other parts of what eventually became the Soviet republics. Right? So Samuel Hodgkins has a wonderful book on this subject that's come out recently. It's called Eastern Internationalism, where he talks about the Persianate zone and their interactions, Persianate intellectuals' interactions with communism after the Bolshevik Revolution. And so in some ways, what we see in the case of Central Asia, right, was, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, is this massive sort of rethinking of national literary traditions under the influence of Bolshevism and so on. And so again, in some ways, we can connect this to phenomena in 20th century phenomenon, right? Like not only the socialist novel in the Indian vernaculars in Urdu and Bangla and so on, but also to the new attention being paid to quote unquote folk forms. Right? Which is why we have Binoy Ghosh writing a Naksha, then we have Himangu Bishwas writing a Mongol Kabbo, and so on. Right? Indigenous forms, popular forms, and folk forms in particular, right, that are now being reconfigured, right, for purposes of political propaganda and so on. And so throughout the mid 20th century, right, I would say starting from the 1930s all the way to the 1970s, we very much see this sort of process in action in various vernaculars. In Punjabi, for example, Aditya Bahel is doing some very important work on Punjabi vernaculars right now, in Tamil and so on and so forth. I mean, apart from the obvious examples of Bangla, Hindi, and Urdu. So there are also these vernaculars where the same kind of process is underway.
So the other term that we see in relation to especially Binoy Ghosh is Rommo Rachana. So Kaalpechar Rachana Samagro, which and he also references a lot he kind of literally quotes from a lot of earlier literature, especially Robert Louis Stevenson seems to be one of his favorites, which also reminds me of what is called the sketch in Victorian England. So sketches by both of more journalistic, kind of an episodic kind of a narrative rather than what happens in the realist novel. So I would like to know a little bit more about how these forms, which are more journalistic, already talked about how the presence of multilingual periodicals or journals are influencing the form of the novel, which is heterogeneous by constitution. But is there something more related to the immediacy of the journalistic prose that kind of seeps into the Naksha, which is also calling itself a Romo Rachana? So how these three things interact?
That's a very good question. And so the answer is yes, obviously, right? And it's interesting that you mentioned the question of journalism, because I mean, right from the very outset of its publication in 1862, right? I think, and Kaliprasanna died shortly after. So Hutoom was being compared to Sketches of Bose, which was written, just maybe 30 years or so earlier in the 1830s. So that comparison was there from the very inception itself. Right? People immediately recognized this in Calcutta, both in the Bangla but also in the English presses, that this is very much, a kind of writing that is inspired by the idea of sketches, by the idea of journalistic short pieces, and so on. And so the idea of, I think, immediacy is an important one, right? As is the idea of ephemerality. That is something which is much more transient, much more fleeting, right? Needs to be captured before it vanishes, before it goes away. Right? This is for Hutoom in particular. And as I said, for Binoy Ghosh, it's slightly more complicated, right? Because he's really, this sociologist who's, read a lot of literature, but also read a lot of social theory, right? Particularly the Chicago school, which he was very invested in, as a matter of training. But so in some ways, the Calcutta that he's trying to map, post-independence, post-partition, right? A city in enormous turmoil, right? But also where people are making, a lot of money from other people's grief and war and famine, right? So a very recurrent theme is this idea that of profiteering, from war, from famine, and so on and so forth, in ways which are not very different from today. Right? And so his project really was to try and, as I said earlier, to try and find elements of proletarian consciousness. Right? That is what he was trying to do. And so he starts to do this by setting out in classic, Marxian / modernist fashion, right? By being a flaneur. Goes for walks around the city, goes to all possible nooks and corners, goes slumming in the modern sense, right? In order to find his sort of proletariat. But beyond questions of immediacy and ephemerality, I think there is another important question, right, that also needs to be talked about, right? And this is where I think the question of media becomes important. That this is also literature's way of trying to come to terms with the new information, economy that is growing up steadily from the 19th century onwards, right? Where literature is no longer sort of, on these timeless themes from, myths and legends that people would recognize, for all times and places, but much more concerned with the quotidianness, with the everydayness of life as it is unfolding, and sort of the constant changes that are taking place, right? So literature is also trying to be more responsive to these changes that are taking place in the realm of the everyday. So we could, talk about the psychopathology of everyday life and things like that. Yeah.
Do you see Naksha? You told us already that it's present in narratives which are not evidently the novelistic, so poetry and drama as well. But do you see it surviving in any concrete sense among the 21st century writers, in the contemporary novel, in the contemporary graphic novel, or is this form, which is so kind of cosmopolitan in its very making, is it kind of entering diasporic literature? If it is not, then what might be some of the reasons behind that?
So that again, depends on how we define the Naksha, right? And as I said, so there are both explicit examples, I think Sarnath Banerjee's graphic novel, which was published, I believe, in 2007 or thereabouts. So that is an explicit sort of nod to the Naqsha in the form of the graphic novel. Right? But there are also implicit, I think, sort of continuities. So, for example, Arvind Adiga is the white tiger, right? Which the character again, who takes on this, non-human persona, right, that of the white tiger, right? And very much does all the things that that the Naqsha narrator does. So in some ways, I think one can make a case, right, that there are both conscious sort of appropriations in the 21st century, but that would again depend on the writer or whoever producing the text is being aware of certain literary traditions and genres. But on the other hand, there are also implicit or unconscious sort of adaptations, right, in which I think, and this I think is far more prevalent, honestly. Right, and we as literary scholars and students of literature, need to recognize this, where people simply, pick up certain modes of representation and depiction and so on and so forth, just because they seem absolutely, suitable and appropriate for their subject matter. Now, so as far as the survival of Naqsha goes, part of me would want to say that there is absolutely every reason for something like the Naqsha to not only survive but flourish at this point, right? Because many of the social and historical sort of conditions that the Naqsha responds to in the 19th and the 20th centuries are very much present and alive in the 21st. In fact, in many ways, they are amplified, right? So we all know the world is ending. Right, so that rhetoric of the end of days and the coming apocalypse, and the gap between the rich and the poor, the warmongers and the victims of war and so on. So in some ways, this is very, I think, appropriate. It continues to be appropriate grounds for the Naqsha.